I'll let you know when there's 5 minutes left and when your time is up, okay? And so, pleasure to introduce Rupert Read. Rupert.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks, Simon. It's great to be here. It's really exciting. So I'm going to try to explore the logic of what's been called civilizational succession with you. The concept is loosely modeled on that of ecological succession. But first, I need to very briefly convince you of the severity of the problem that we confront. Maybe I'm hoping I don't need to do very much of that with this audience. I'll merely draw attention to the Cristina Figueres letter that probably many of you saw yesterday, basically saying we've got 3 years left to stop ourselves going beyond 2 degrees of global overheat. And as is well known, if we go beyond 2 degrees, we may well get onto a conveyor belt that pushes us up eventually towards 6 degrees and possibly a lot more. So that raises the question, will we do this? Will we as a species make this unprecedented change within the next 3 years? It seems to me that before the advent of Trump, the chances of us doing so were extremely low, and they may have been slightly improved in that people are now kind of angry and trying to pull together against Trump, but they've also been massively unimproved because we've got Trump and his policies. So will we do this? I very much hope he will. I'm totally with those who are trying to make us do it, but I think it is unlikely that we will do it. So I think that, to say the least, I think that we need to face up to climate reality, which, funnily enough, is the name of the project which my think tank Greenhouse has recently embarked on. And I have 4 copies here for lucky, keen people in the audience of our introductory report to our project. Anyone who wishes to claim one, come and get one afterwards to find out all about it, or it's freely available on our website. So what hope is there of us changing this situation where, as I say, the prognosis, it seems to me, is that the chances of us actually doing what is necessary, this unprecedented transformation or transition, are very slim. What hope is there of this situation changing? What kind of radical, unexpected events, what kind of white or black swan could lead us to a situation where our civilization is not under mortal threat? It seems to me that the one which is most in the air at the moment is the populist wave on the left. Quite a lot of people are hoping that because of the rise of people like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn and others in other countries, Podemos and so on, maybe there's a chance of people rising to power really soon who are going to be able to put us onto a radically different course. I think this hope is an extremely vain one. On the left, there is today a deathly embrace of the same old gods of production, progress, and growthism. And there is also now an endless journey into liberal individualist identity consumerism. The latter is a particularly worrying trend for us here, thinking about the climate. And I now direct your attention to your handouts. Does everyone have a handout? You've all got a handout? Everyone in sight of one of these? Yeah? So I'm going to skip over quote 1, which is just sort of generally to frame the thing, and take you to quotation number 2. This is a very famous statement from the Combahee River collective of black feminists, who were the people who introduced the term identity politics. And you see, it's a simple sentence. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. So this thought may have been fine and even perhaps entirely necessary for black women at that time, trying, understandably and rightly, to make feminism more representative. But it is a dangerous idea in terms of blocking or deprobabilifying projects of assembling majorities for socio-political transformation. And it is a cataclysmic idea for animal rights, for environmentalism, and for activism on behalf of future people. For these movements are by definition concerned with working to end somebody else's oppression. Climate action stands by definition against the notion that the most radical thing is to work to end your own oppression. The narcissism of extreme identity politics involves a systematic retreat into the present day and into the self. It motivates idiocies that I've heard, such as people saying things like, well, we don't really know what future generations will need, and it's presumptuous to speak for them. Therefore, we should focus on the present. We should focus on liberating ourselves. So much for identity politics. We're also deeply possessed on the left by the idea that things have been getting better and better and are going to keep on getting better and better. We're deeply possessed by the ideology of progress, and that brings us to quotation number 3, which I'll touch on just very briefly. This is from Ishigo's masterful work, which I hope many of you know, Never Let Me Go, which was also made into a film. The scenario in Never Let Me Go is you have a future where everything's brilliant because medicine has advanced so far that everybody leads really long, illness-free lives. There's just one catch, which is that you have to have a class of people whose organs are harvested in order for this wonderful future to eventuate. And towards the end of the novel, this is kind of the denouement, one of the main characters sums up in this wonderful way how very difficult it is to row back from this wonderful utopian, dystopian future. Quote, "There was no way to reverse the process. How can you ask a world that has come to regard cancer as curable? How can you ask such a world to put away that cure, to go back to the dark days? There is no going back. Even if the cost, in the case of this fictive scenario, is the appalling human cost I just mentioned, or in our case, even if the cost is to crash the entire system. I think it's going to be unbelievably difficult to ask people to give up the idea of ever-improving ultra-high-tech healthcare, not to mention our mobiles and a million other things. The left is totally bought into the ideology of progress, and it's going to be very hard to find a way out of it. And then let's turn explicitly to growth, the engine of so-called progress, and turn to quotation number 4. So I've got here a few little tiny quotes for you from the recent Labour manifesto, in which absolutely front and centre is faster economic growth. And this, they don't even pretend that this is going to be so-called green growth, which is in any case a fantasy. They say our industrial strategy is one for growth across all sectors. If we were going to transform this civilization and save ourselves, we would already have something like green governments in 2017. We're so far from this situation that the idea is almost laughable. I see absolutely no reasonable basis for the notion that left or progressive governments, even if they could come to power in the next few years, will save us. We need some much more radical change, which is not on the cards. We need, for example, a doctrine which I call enoughism, the idea that we don't have to have endless growth. We don't have to have endless so-called progress. We don't have to have endless development. There's a stage at which we will say, that's enough. This is a radical transformation of a kind which we have never experienced before. So we have to take very seriously the likelihood that we will face at least some degree of runaway climate change, all other things being equal, possibly, of course, including releasing the methane, in which case the runaway will not be even stoppable. In this context, it seems to me that civilizational succession is our best option. It's the best that we can realistically hope for. It's not like a kind of last resort. It's actually the best realistic hope. We must face the strong likelihood of this civilization coming to an end in an unplanned way. And that brings me to quotation number 5 from my handout from the great William Offells from his recent masterful little book, Immoderate Greatness, Why Civilizations Fail. Quote, "Just as prudent mariners carry lifeboats and practice abandoning ship, a global civilization in its terminal phase would be well advised to prepare arks, storehouses, and banks, designed to preserve the persons, tools, and materials with which to retain or reconstitute some semblance of civilized life post-collapse." That, it seems to me, is a key task that we have today. We need to seed what might be a viable successor civilization from out of the brilliance and squalor and ruins of this one. We need to model the genuine communities to come. This is why the transition movement, permaculture, and so on are so important. At a smaller scale still, on a personal, homestead, neighborhood scale, what this also means is that we need to prep for the possibility of seriously bad and hard times ahead. At a much larger scale, and above all perhaps, we need what myself and my students are calling a new imaginary, a new way of conceiving ourselves in the world, getting away from those old ideologies and assumptions of progress, growth, and so on. The new imaginary will probably include notions of embeddedness, of enough, and of long-termism. It would be an imaginary capable of being the philosophical and ethical kernel of the new civilization that could follow our global civilization. Assuming that our self-destruction is not absolutely total, what forms of political and social organization emerge out of a world with a seriously degraded climate is the important question. And the political and intellectual battle never ends, precisely because the future is open and still to be made. Now, we need somehow to do all this while being all too aware of the very strong likelihood that the new civilization will have to pass through a most unholy baptism of fire, the fire of global overheat, and the fire of the resource wars and desperate migrations and extreme turbulence that will accompany it. You will have noticed, by the way, that whereas the previous speaker was concerned about over-dramatization, I'm concerned about under-dramatization. I'm concerned about the very serious risk, which I think is almost omnipresent, that virtually all of us, virtually all the time, are in denial about the seriousness of the prospect that we face. And that it's very easy to kind of castigate a fool like Trump. And it's very easy to miss the extent to which we actually share a great deal in common with him in terms of actually assuming that we don't have to radically transform our civilization. The transitional period is reasonably likely to be a long and dire emergency, a nightmare compared to which the suffering involved in previous world wars may come, incredibly, to seem relatively minor. We have to try to start to construct some of the potential elements of a successor civilization, both ideational and practical, in such a way that we can survive this baptism of fire and not be corrupted in the process. And when you stop for a moment to think this point through, it makes our task even harder. For if there is to be a civilization to succeed this one, it will have to be tough enough to survive, without being turned wholly vicious. It will have to be tough enough to survive a time that is quite likely literally to test humanity more severely by far than we've been tested before. The signs in terms of things like our willingness to be caring to refugees, including climate refugees, which we already have, are, to say the least, thus far rather mixed. There have to be lifeboats, but how does one build lifeboats that are not so viciously exclusive that they undermine their own worth? Perhaps the task then is not even as easy as building just one new civilization. Perhaps we need to plan on two in sequence, and again, this is why I talk about civilizational succession. Perhaps the real task is to build a lifeboat now, for us, is to start to think about building a lifeboat civilization, a decent and yet realistic and pragmatic ethic, unafraid to be determined to survive at most, not all, costs. A civilization that can carry some of us through the storms of our children, and that can somehow carry within it the seeds of a future successor, less harsh civilization that might exist and truly flourish in a less awfully pressed time that we might one day be able to recover to. So much as some knowledge and wisdom survive the Middle Ages in monasteries, so perhaps a key task now for us is to create what some have called ecosteries. Seed banks, both literal and metaphorical, for a possible future civilization to come once this one has demised and we've transitioned entirely beyond it. A superb fictive model for these ecosteries might be Margaret Atwood's Gardeners in her post-climatic disaster novel After the Flood. If this is our task, creating two future civilizations in sequence, then it is even harder than I made it appear earlier. We may have to make some pretty awful compromises even to be able to seed a future civilization at all. The lifeboat civilization may not be pretty, because if a lifeboat is to float, eventually one will have to stop letting people aboard. The trick will be somehow to survive without becoming vicious, and somehow to carry forward a torch for a kinder, more civil future within that survival. A great fictive model for this is The Child in the Road, the novel and film that I'm sure many of you know, and the superb idea that he develops of carrying the fire. To make any headway with any of this, conferences like this are important, because we have to face climate reality collectively if we are really to face it at all. Václav Havel penned in his great essay, The Power of the Powerless, some deeply wise words that speak directly to our condition, of having to face a difficult reality. His idea of living in truth seems particularly pertinent for times when post-truthism, a product of consumerism applied to ideas and therethrough to reality itself, has absurdly become widespread, at the very time when reality is about to bite us harder than it ever has done before. see on this, on the handout, quotation number 6. I shan't read it out, but it's a beautifully powerful exposition of the kind of situation that we're in, it seems to me. These words of Havel's resonate, it seems to me. They diagnose us. They offer us a challenge to rise to now. In the same essay, Havel wrote something that seems to me to carry over even more directly to our own predicament today. He spoke of the state's desperate attempt to plug up the dreadful wellspring of truth, a truth which might cause incalculable transformations in social consciousness. We might add also corporations' desperate efforts to plug up the dreadful wellspring of truth. So the question is, do we dare to seek to cause an incalculable transformation in social consciousness? One that might be enough yet to radically transform this civilization, or rather more likely, to see the new civilization, the civilization or civilizations worth birthing from this one's death throes. Havel spoke of the totalitarian effort to defend the integrity of the world of appearances in order to defend itself. Are we willing and able to stop engaging in such defense and to unmask it, to stop defending ourselves against reality and truth itself? Havel wrote that the moment someone breaks through in one place, when one person cries, "The emperor is naked," when a single person breaks the rules of the game, thus exposing it as a game, everything suddenly appears in another light, and the whole crust seems then to be made of a tissue on the point of tearing and disintegrating uncontrollably. Can we be the ones to cry out that the emperor is naked? I admit, not a pretty picture applied to the emperor of the US, but in any case. The East Bloc regimes proved astoundingly fragile. Perhaps then we might hope that our civilization's hegemony, its death embrace with the insanity of perpetual industrial growthism, is less assured, less solid than it seems. Perhaps it might yet melt into air. This seems, however, decidedly unlikely. One can take some hope from all sorts of movements of liberation in history, from the Velvet Revolutions to most recently Jeremy Corbyn's remarkable showing in the 2017 UK general election. But we have absolutely no precedent for a revolutionary radical transformation that centrally involves long-termism and care for the voiceless, rather than some kind of liberation of ourselves or of some human group. The closest there is to such a precedent appears to be the way that the surviving prehistoric future eaters, described by Tim Flannery in the eponymous book, which I much recommend to those of you who don't know it. The future eaters, superb metaphor, which he applies back to the prehistoric peoples who destroyed their megafauna and applies also to ourselves. The prehistoric future eaters seem to have managed to learn from their destruction of the megafauna and of their own ecosystems, and to have left to many of their indigenous descendants ways of living harmoniously and lightly on the earth. But note, they had to go through terrible population crashes, as well as animal extinctions, and extinctions of entire groups who probably decimated their own environments beyond the point of no return, and were therefore eliminated from the gene pool. They had to go through all of this in order to learn this painful knowledge. Now, we may have been hoping that there would be a precedent for the revolutionary transformation that we are in need of without such pain and destruction, but one is not in evidence. Moreover, if we do thoroughly crash our civilization, then the danger is that it will take down almost everything necessary for any large-scale civilization with it. The collapse may well be global and virtually complete, as suggested, for example, by James Lovelock in The Revenge of Gaia, and perhaps, therefore, even irrecoverable. So, we need to reach much higher and longer than we have ever done so before. So, friends and colleagues, I hope we will. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Any questions? Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much, Rupert. I found myself agreeing with nearly everything you said, which obviously might raise the question, have I got a question? To proclaim on this, we can rather feel like modern Cassandras. You know, it almost seems a wasted endeavour to make these proclamations. Just a quick question, though. Any civilization to come will exist in a world of less and less, unlike previous civilizations where they've started elsewhere and new resources have been opened up, but we're going to be encountering less and less stuff. So if we do survive, this is obviously a problem. There's going to be less resources. But my main question is, the lifeboat metaphor, it assumes that someone will come along and rescue you. So is this really the best metaphor? Because a lifeboat is just transitory, and then you expect a boat to come along and pick you up. Whereas, is it going to be like that? It doesn't seem that it will be. So
In that sense, the lifeboat metaphor may again be too optimistic. I guess one's thinking of something like a lifeboat where what one does is get in the lifeboats and then rows to shore, something like that. Prophecy, yes. Cassandra, yes. But remember that, as David pointed out, it's always important to remember that these are never pure prophecies in the sense of fatalistic prophecies. One of the reasons one does this kind of thing, for example, is to try to help people to wake up. Which I think it's very, very difficult for us to really wake up and face the situation that we're in. So it's not really exactly prophecy. It's more the creation of scenarios and then the attempt to try to decide which scenario we're going to try to actualize. But I totally agree with you that it can feel very much as if one is, obviously one is saying things that hardly anyone wants to hear. Right, including oneself, and therefore, in some sense, it's quite lonely. But therefore, I think it's especially important to do this kind of thing. And what I'm hoping and thinking, sitting here feeling quite nervous and exposed, is that this is an opportunity to build or find a little community and to feel a bit less desperate and desolate. As a result. This is the point of finishing with the quotation number 8 on the handout, which I just sort of leave you with as a sort of envoi. Paul Gingsnorth's very challenging thoughts that there is an abyss open before us, and we have to look into it. And that I think is our test here today.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I agree with you that the Labour Party manifesto was nothing like radical enough on this and many other things. But the question I want to put to you is something you mentioned in passing, is that the transition movement is so important. And I just wonder whether you just say a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses you see from the point of view of all that you've been saying this morning about the transition movement and what it offers us.
Great, thank you. So, firstly, a word more on Labour. Really, in a way, the point that I'm making is that Labour under Corbyn and Sanders, in terms of what we're talking about here, they haven't even got to first base. Right? They're nowhere. In fact, they might even be worse than nowhere, because although there's good environmental stuff in Labour's manifesto and in Sanders' programme, it's got good stuff about not building oil pipelines and so on and so forth. They call for faster economic growth, and they don't even pretend that it's going to be so-called green growth, which doesn't even exist anyway. Right? So, a very senior friend of mine in the Green Party used to make a little joke. This is sort of between ourselves. I know we're being filmed here, but anyway, some years ago she said, "Vote Tory, save the planet," and what she meant by that is that the Conservatives are often so bad, actually, and the Republicans in the States so bad at managing the economy that they often cause less economic growth than Labour or Democrat governments. I mean, you look at the 1990s in the United States and compared to the 2000s, it's absolutely fascinating that Clinton has, these half-decent environmental regulations. Bush comes along, strips out the regulations. You think, how desperately bad to have a Republican president. But Bush was so rubbish at managing the economy in the interest of growth compared to Clinton, that if you actually look at the totality of environmental indicators in the Clinton years and the Bush years, it was worse in the Clinton years, because the faster growth undid the environmental regulations, more than undid them. So Corbyn and Sanders might be worse than nothing, in terms of what we're interested in here. In terms of the transition movement, so I've written about this, and you can find it on the web if you want. I've debated it with Rob Hopkins. I think the transition movement is brilliant and absolutely necessary. I think, however, unfortunately, it's a serious mistake to think that the transition movement is enough, because the transition movement can only work in the context of the right political framework. And the reason why is that if what you have is a lot of people transitioning and a lot of other people not transitioning, then the people who are transitioning are using less oil and so on and so forth. All they succeed in doing is sending a massive price signal to the others. It's fine to consume even more oil, even more quickly. In other words, the price is low. And it looks like we're going to be seeing some of that at the moment. The price of oil is relatively low, so lots of things become economically viable to use that oil for, which otherwise weren't. Transition is absolutely essential, but as a demonstration, as a series of demonstration projects, and as a way of preparing ourselves for the potentiality of actual collapse, right? In terms of a scenario for transforming our civilization, transition cannot possibly be enough. So if we're trying to think about a transformational scenario, we have to get the politics right. As I said, we're not even at first base on that. So if we think beyond that to the likelihood of collapse and back to the lifeboat civilization type scenario, then transition becomes vital as a way of starting to kind of tool us up and prepare us. So it's a kind of macro scale prepping. And it's also a way of actually modeling, again, the ideology of enough, enoughism, which again relates to the previous question, right? This, again, is a hugely challenging aspect of what we face. We are going to have a future in which, for the first time in a long time, people are going to have to be used to having less. Is that always going to be conceived of as a constraint, as something regrettable, in which case we're simply setting ourselves up for further and worse fails? Or can we manage somehow to embrace it? Can we manage somehow to think, yeah, it's actually a good thing not to have too much? If we can, then again, transition is going to be hugely, hugely important in making that happen.
Thank you very much indeed. I just have a question. I mean, there's so many things that you've raised, but about how do you get a hearing for what you're saying? Because you really attack some sacred cows. And thinking about the left, I mean, the left to me seems very much hijacked by what I would call a kind of ideology of economism that, as you said, it's obsessed with things like growth and
Production.
on the news. Yes, and on the news, we're meant to be, for some reason, it's more important for us to know how a high street supermarket has done, what its returns are this year, than various other things that I would say are rather more pressing about the world. So, and the left doesn't seem to critique that. And when you criticised identity politics, I'm sure you must have experienced this, but I know this from a rather different position, quite the kind of vilification, anybody criticising some of the contemporary turn to identity politics would get, to the point in which you won't get a hearing at all, you may get shut down or potentially even find yourself on the wrong side of the law over some of these sorts of issues. So I just wonder, you mentioned the transition movement and said that really at best that's a kind of prefigurative sort of thing, not an answer. But how do you envisage getting a hearing for this? I mean, this is an unusual forum, but how does it become get any kind of cultural momentum?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's really, really important. So I've given talks on elements of what I've given talks on here today, and I've written stuff about it and published articles and stuff about it before. I've never before today come right out and put it all together in this way and said anything quite as radical. I chose to do so because of the very specific nature of this event. And also because I've come to think over the last year that our situation is sufficiently desperate that my previous caution I should try to find ways of starting to throw it to the wind. I still don't feel ready to publish this, at least not with my own name attached to it. So I'm only part way, but I'm inching into the pond. In terms of the sacred cows, I mean, absolutely, and this is part of what makes the situation so desperate. Growth is hegemonic, progress is hegemonic, development is hegemonic, identity politics is hegemonic. I got to the point of thinking one has to speak out on identity politics because of the precise point that I made. You have this wonderful sounding statement by the Combahee River Collective And we've had the huge and ever-growing tranche of identity politics ever since. And you think about it and you realize, but that's just incompatible with climate activism. So something has to give. Well, I think it better be that identity politics gives. Because if what gives is the climate, then all bets are off. So yeah, I think we have to start to face up to these things. I don't know how one gets a hearing for them. I would love ideas from those minds assembled here. I think we have to try to start to work this out together if we're going to get anywhere at all in this incredibly challenging task.
Thank you very much.
Time for one more question, Susanna.
Hi, thank you. First of all, I want to say just that I do agree with you, but I want to know if you have any ideas about what this succession of new civilizations will look like. So from my own research, there are two basic frameworks that I see in terms of people who are thinking along your lines, although maybe not with the same notions of climate. So I've done work amongst preppers, and I noticed you kept using the word to prep. So these are people who are working on the household level in energy independence for that house with solar panels and getting their own water. So there's that very, very micro scale of survival. So the civilization will literally be independent households. And the other one that I see quite prevalent is this idea that technology is going to save us. You know, we're going to go into space, fully automated luxury communism style. And I just wanted to see if you had looked at those strategies and if those were the kind of things that you would see as viable or not, and if so, what would you see as this viable new civilization?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So, yes, you noticed that I spoke about prepping. I think we should all be prepping. I mean, I'm prepping in my small, pathetic way. Examples, I've got lots of money under my mattress. I mean, it's not literally under my mattress. But I would encourage you all to have lots of money somewhere, not under your mattress. I mean cash. I've got a bulletproof vest. I've got lots of cans in the loft. Is any of this going to do me any good? Probably not, but it's a little start. Of course, the problem with the preppers considered as a movement is their extreme individualism and their depoliticization. What it seems to me we need to do is start to actually try to combine all of these things to have a prepping that kind of fits with transition, that fits with green political movements, that fits with building a new imaginary, which should, I think, have philosophical and spiritual aspects. That's a big task, but yeah, I think that prepping is part of the solution. As for technophilia, I think it's no part of the solution. I think it's an absolute catastrophe. It's, again, absolutely hegemonic. Fully automated luxury communism, catastrophic idea, very attractive to people on the left, in utter fantasy. Elon Musk, it seems to me, is another complete disaster zone. He's doing some good things, some good technological innovations, but he gives people this completely fatal idea that, well, all you need to do is empower people like him, and everything's going to be taken care of. And you can tell how catastrophic his ideas are when you look at some of the things that people don't hear about so much that he believes in. For example, he believes that we don't actually exist. He believes that we're almost certainly in a matrix. And this is extreme, this is extreme anti-materialism, extreme avoidance of facing reality. And some of the things he's actually doing, like space tourism. I mean, if you want to have one direct route to frying our climate forever, space tourism is that route. So that's Elon Musk. And all of this stuff all this technophilia is just a search for what Jean-Paul Sartre called a reprieve. It's just people wanting to think, someone else is going to take care of this. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to change anything. I don't have to change my lifestyle. Right? That's why everyone hopes that technology is going to save us. Technology is absolutely not going to save us. Of course, technological improvements are one part of the solution, like solar panels. Of course, that's one part of what we need to do, although we should question the fetishization of the industrialization, the industrial rollout of them, right? It's not clear that the very large-scale rolling out of solar panels and of wind turbines is a good idea. It looks more like it's just a desperate attempt to keep the mega machine rolling forward. So it should be something closer to the way that transitioners and indeed some preppers are thinking about it. We've got to have an idea of enough, right? Without some kind of idea of enough, all that technophilia is going to do is going to push things, kick the can a little bit further down the road, and is going to lead to an even more dire collapse.
Thank you, Rupert. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mike.